A girl promises to marry a millionaire when she turns 18, and years later, a beautiful young woman kisses the millionaire. Then he discovers something incredible. Comment with a score from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream echoed through the brownstone streets of Beacon Hill at precisely 3 in the afternoon, cutting through the humid air like a knife. The 52-year-old millionaire businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he turned away from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity that made his chest tighten inexplicably. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that contrasted brutally with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. His fortune, accumulated through strategic investments in the stock market, had provided him with the best address in the area, but it couldn't buy the silence he so craved. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of Bradford Construction, one of the largest companies in the region, he was accustomed to solving complex problems involving millions in net worth. He preferred to steer clear of other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon that she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes bloodshot from the bourbon she had been drinking since noon, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the booze. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before she went to sleep. It was all that was left of her now. Fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whining!" the aunt grunted, putting the spoon away in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smear the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room in the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His late wife used to sing it while she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. In the house next to the Victorian, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl's song. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. The educator dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly spoken with the troubled woman, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the millionaire remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before his wife's accident. The employee was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers gripped the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over Beacon Hill, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities. The following morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the historic neighborhood awakening to another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and carefully combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and bloodshot eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the other to back away. "And I'd really like to meet your niece. I've heard she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. She's sick, high fever, best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 sons." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window as he drank coffee. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye, but not before casting an investigative look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" The woman snarled, her irritation intensified by her hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The child went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while she worked, the woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... "Seems like the girl's name is Lily," the businessman murmured, his cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named that. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of the woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How had he not made that connection before? The millionaire put his cell phone away and began to pace back and forth in his condo. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid proper attention. Now, 5 years later, his ex-employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands, it seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the millionaire couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His investments in Bitcoin and his financial assets seemed insignificant compared to what was happening. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His wealth accumulated over the years gave him power, but would it be enough to help a child in such a desperate situation? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent request to her mother that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. His assets in dollars could solve many problems, but how could he use his fortune to save a child without causing more problems? 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. He had been spending. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's condo on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university nearly 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," the lawyer said, sitting down in the condo's spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The millionaire poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, pulling a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screaming. Neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," the millionaire replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. The child's mother worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," the lawyer completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention back then, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screaming echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to smear the walls?" the woman screamed, holding the girl's arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a curse, a blight on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed about her mother, and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hallway. "And if I hear even a peep, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she huddled in the corner and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but laden with a sadness that broke the woman's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, she went directly to downtown Beacon Hill, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker, a former student of hers, raised her eyes from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davison, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm certain she's being mistreated." The caseworker straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years in the position, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious. And Mrs. Davison was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," she said, grabbing a complaint form. While the educator related her observations, across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively while the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on the cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked the lawyer, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." Thus, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing noting the teacher's report when her phone rang. Child Protective Services, speaking. "This is the district attorney. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on the Brownstone Street. We have evidence of severe child abuse." The caseworker paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow Victorian house?" "Exactly." "How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," she replied, looking at the teacher with surprise. "2 independent sources. That confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being assembled. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the Brownstone Street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. His lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol, leaving the child locked in the stuffy room. The girl continued to hum softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside exceeded even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said the caseworker, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken with her in the yard. A flicker of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt will be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the educator, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" And so, after months of silent suffering, the child was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear, beginning a journey that would lead her back to the light she had lost.